Payback times.
The flag was amber. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the file name, not the timestamp, just that small bright wedge of color in a column that was supposed to stay green forever. I'd been standing at my desk for 11 hours, and my feet were telling me about every one of them. The co-working floor was empty at this hour. The other startups dark behind their glass partitions. The cold brew taps silent for once. The only sounds were the HVAC cycling through the ceiling ducts and the distant percussion of rain starting against the skylights. I'd been cross-referencing our third-quarter infrastructure costs against the new cloud pricing tiers, the kind of grinding administrative work I did at night, so daytime hours stayed clear for actual building. My eyes were dry. The screen was the brightest thing in the room. I almost scrolled past it. The file transfer log was 312 lines of routine activity. Automated backups, sync confirmations, the usual noise of a system doing what systems do. I'd written the alert protocol myself, back when we were first hardening the platform's security posture. Green meant normal. Amber meant a file above a certain sensitivity threshold had moved to an external destination. I'd configured the thresholds carefully, tagging our core algorithm files specifically, and in 6 months, the log had never shown me anything but green. NF_core_algo_v7_final, copied to external storage device, 6:47 p.m. I'd left for a client dinner at 6:30. I stood very still. The HVAC hummed. Rain ticked against the glass. I set down my coffee cup with more care than the situation required. The way you move when some part of your brain is already telling your hands to slow down even though your conscious mind hasn't caught up yet. I pulled up the access log. The credentials were Declan's. I read the entry 3 times. I wasn't misreading it. I'm not someone who The HVAC felt very loud. I straightened up from the desk and looked out through the glass wall at the dark innovation floor beyond, the empty standing desks, the motivational lettering someone had vinyl cut onto the far wall, the little neon sign above the phone booth pods that read, "Make something real." 3 other startups shared this floor with us. None of them were here at 11 on a Wednesday. None of them would have any reason to care about an amber flag in my transfer log. This was mine to sit with. I pulled out the chair I almost never used and sat down. 18 months ago, I stood in front of a whiteboard in a conference room in Capitol Hill and drew Declan Marsh a picture of his own future. I used 3 colors of marker in approximately 45 minutes of his time, and by the end of it, he was leaning forward in his chair with his jacket off and his tie loosened, and I knew I had him. That's not arrogance, that's pattern recognition. I'd watched enough pitch meetings from enough sides of the table to know what genuine excitement looked like versus polite attention, and Declan was genuinely excited. He had reason to be. What I was showing him was elegant. An AI-driven supply chain optimization platform that could reduce fulfillment latency by 32% for mid-market logistics companies, built on a prediction architecture I'd been developing in my spare hours for the better part of a year. I had the code. I had 2 patents in adjacent machine learning optimization space that gave the technical claims real credibility. What I didn't have was Declan's contact list. That's the honest version of how Nexaflow Technologies started. I had the engine. Declan had the room. He was the kind of man who seemed to know everyone and owe nobody, which is a combination rare enough to be genuinely useful. Tall, easy in his own skin, with the particular confidence of someone who'd spent 15 years in enterprise sales and learned that the most powerful thing you can do in any negotiation is make the other person feel like they called the meeting. He laughed easily, remembered names, and had an instinct for which conversations were worth having and which ones weren't. He'd had a partial exit from a logistics software company 2 years earlier. Nothing enormous, but enough to give him credibility in the rooms I needed him to open. We were complementary. That's what I told myself. Builder and door opener, engineer and evangelist. I'd watched enough successful partnerships to know that model worked when both people played their position honestly. The afternoon we drafted the partnership agreement, we were at a coffee shop on I Street because Declan said he thought better somewhere with good espresso. And I'd learned already that letting Declan have his atmosphere preferences cost me nothing and bought me his good mood. I had a yellow legal pad. He had a latte. The afternoon light was doing something nice through the front windows. It felt, if I'm being honest, like the beginning of something real. We got through equity splits in about 20 minutes. Declan had opinions, 50-50 with a vesting cliff, standard enough. And I didn't fight him on it because the equity conversation wasn't the one that mattered most to me. I let him feel like he'd won that table before I got to the one I actually needed. We should talk about the IP structure, I said, turning to a fresh page. Declan picked up his latte. Meaning what, exactly? Meaning who owns the underlying code, the algorithm architecture, the technical methodology. I kept my voice even, the way I did when I was explaining something to a junior engineer who'd made a confident wrong assumption. No condescension, just clarity. I've been building the core prediction engine for about 11 months. The foundational work predates any LLC filing. We need to establish what that means for ownership. He smiled, that easy, unhurried smile. Sol, come on. We're partners. That stuff works itself out. It works itself out better when we write it down. You're going to own half the company. The company's going to own the IP. It's clean. The company owning IP and me having equity in the company aren't the same protection, I said. If something happens to the partnership, nothing's going to happen to the partnership. He said it warmly, the way you'd reassure a friend who is catastrophizing. We're not going to be those people. We're going to build something great and then have a very pleasant argument about who gets the bigger office. I almost pushed. I remember that. The half second when I had the words ready, when I could have said, Declan, I need this in writing specifically. I need inventor attribution. I need pre-existing IP carved out. I need a proper assignment schedule. I had the vocabulary. I had the instincts. I was someone who had sat across from corporate IP attorneys and held my own. Someone who understood the architecture of a patent claim well enough to have written 2 of them. And I let it go. I told myself I'd circle back, that we'd get a proper attorney to clean up the language before anything material happened, that partnership agreements were living documents and we were still in the foundation pouring stage. Mostly, I think, I didn't want to be the person who poisoned the mood at the beginning. I knew how to read a room. The room wanted to believe we were different, that we were the partnership that didn't get buried in contractual anxiety at the starting line. I wanted to believe it too. I turned to a fresh page and we talked about revenue splits. The agreement was 12 pages. I had it open on my laptop now, reading it with the particular attention I usually reserved for debugging code that was almost right but not quite, looking for the logic error, the misplaced conditional, the assumption that had seemed safe and wasn't. Page 7. I'd read this clause before. I'd read this whole document before, during, and after it was drafted, but I'd been reading it as a document that established our collaboration, and I was reading it now as a document that established ownership. They turned out to be different reads. All work product developed jointly by the parties in furtherance of Nexaflow Technologies LLC's business objectives shall be the sole and exclusive property of Nexaflow Technologies LLC. 12 words that looked like a protection. The company owns the IP. The company is ours together. Therefore, the IP is ours together. It had seemed logical in the abstract. Now, I walked through it the way I'd walk through a flawed function call. The word jointly was doing enormous work in that sentence, and nobody had defined it. What did jointly developed mean? Did it mean both parties had to write code? Both parties had to contribute intellectual content? Was Declan's participation in sales strategy sufficient to make him a joint developer of the algorithm I'd been building since before he'd heard my name? The agreement didn't say. There was no definition section. There was no inventor attribution schedule. No document listing. Who had actually created which components of the technology. There was no carve-out anywhere in 12 pages for pre-existing IP. That last one was the blade. Pre-existing IP is work you created before a partnership was formed. It's foundational legal hygiene in any technology partnership to explicitly identify it, document it, and clarify its status. Either the founder retains ownership and licenses it to the company, or there's a formal assignment with specific terms. What you never do is let it blur into the background, unaddressed, while a vague clause about jointly developed work product sits in a contract above both your signatures. Because if you do that, anyone with a decent attorney can later argue that everything belongs to the LLC, including the work you did before the LLC existed. including the proprietary architecture you spent 11 months developing alone, including the engine you built in your home office at midnight, while Declan Marsh was selling something else entirely. I sat back in my chair. I was a person who had navigated the patent examination process twice. I understood prior art, inventorship attribution, the difference between a method claim and a system claim. I had spent actual money on IP attorneys for my personal patent filings, and I had signed a partnership agreement with a clause I'd have flagged as inadequate in 30 seconds, if I'd been reviewing it for anyone else. That's the specific texture of how smart people make bad decisions. It's not ignorance. It's the gap between knowing something in the abstract and applying it when the stakes feel premature, when the room is warm, when the person across the table is charming and optimistic and makes you feel like the person who keeps raising legal concerns is the one being difficult. I opened a second window and pulled up my patent filings. Both patents named me as sole inventor. Both were filed before Nexaflow's LLC formation date. The technical claims in each were narrower than the full algorithm, but the underlying architecture, the prediction engine, the data weighting methodology, the core optimization logic, was clearly ancestral to what now lived in that copied file. Third window. My code commit history from the private repository I'd maintained before we migrated everything to the company's infrastructure. 11 months of commits timestamped with my credentials attached to every one. The earliest modules that would eventually become Nexaflow's core product were there, dated 4 months before our LLC paperwork was filed. The trail existed. I had not been careless enough to destroy it, even accidentally. The timestamps didn't lie, and they predated the partnership by enough margin to matter. What I didn't have was a document that said so. What I didn't have was the one piece of paper that would have made all of this clean. A proper IP assignment agreement executed at the time the partnership was formed, specifying that I was the inventor of the listed technology, describing the specific work product being assigned to the LLC, explicitly carving out pre-existing IP and documenting the terms under which it was being licensed or contributed, and signed before either of us spent $1 of Nexaflow money. That document would have taken a competent attorney half a day to draft, and maybe $300 to execute. Instead, I had an amber flag and a 12-page agreement with a vague clause and a co-founder who'd copied our core algorithm to an external device 17 minutes after I walked out the front door. I closed the agreement. I did not close my laptop in frustration. I did not sit there cataloging everything I should have done differently 18 months ago. I am not built for that particular indulgence. What I did was open a new folder, label it documentation, and begin making copies. The transfer log, the access log, the partnership agreement, both patent filings, the commit history export with timestamps intact. I moved deliberately without hurry. The same methodical attention I brought to anything that needed to be right. This was now a problem with a shape. Problems with shapes have solutions. When I had what I needed, I closed the laptop, picked up my bag, and put on my coat. The overnight security guard at the building's main desk looked up as I came through the lobby. I gave him the same nod I gave him every late night. He gave me the same two-finger wave. The rain had started in earnest. My car was in the structure across the street. I sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine and listened to the rain work its way over the roof. The parking structure muffled it to something almost restful. The windows fogged at the edges. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for my coat to stop feeling cold. Eventually, I picked up my phone. Not to call anyone. There was no one to call at this hour who could do anything useful, and I wasn't the kind of person who called people to narrate her own anxiety. I was thinking about Declan, specifically about what I actually knew versus what I was inferring, and I wanted to test the inference before I built anything on top of it. I opened LinkedIn. I don't have a particular habit of checking Declan's profile. We talked every day. I didn't need to surveil his professional presence. But there's something clarifying about seeing a person the way the world sees them, stripped of the context of shared history and lunch orders and the particular dynamic that builds up between two people who spend most of their waking hours in the same project. His profile looked the way it always had. Sharp headshot, well-curated experience section, the kind of summary paragraph that sounded like it had been written by someone who'd taken a profile optimization course and actually paid attention. Then I saw it. Under current projects, where before there had been a line about Nexaflow's go-to-market strategy, There was something new. Added, according to the activity timestamp 2 days ago. Exploring strategic licensing opportunities in AI supply chain optimization. I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the passenger seat and looked at the fogged windshield. Strategic licensing. Not building. Not deploying. Not expanding to new markets or clients or use cases. The language Declan used every single day when he talked about the company's trajectory. Licensing. Which meant he already had something he thought he could license. Which meant the file, sitting on whatever external device he'd used at 6:47 p.m., wasn't a backup. It was an asset he was already positioning. He wasn't covering his tracks, he was shopping. My stomach dropped the way it does in that first moment when a bad hypothesis proves out. Not surprise exactly, more like the cold settling of a thing you'd half known finding its final shape. I'd spent 18 months watching Declan work a room, and I knew exactly how fast he could move when he'd decided something was worth moving on. He would have contacts already. He would have had a conversation, maybe two. He would have been careful enough not to show anything specific yet, but the groundwork would be there. The algorithm that I had built alone, over 11 months of midnight sessions and debugging iterations that Declan had observed without contributing a single line of code. That algorithm was sitting on an external drive somewhere, and Declan Marsh was describing it to potential licensees as a strategic opportunity. I picked my phone back up. I looked at the LinkedIn entry one more time. Then I opened my contacts and scrolled to a name I hadn't called in 8 months. A woman I'd met during my MBA program, who'd gone on to specialize in technology IP litigation. We'd stayed in loose touch. She was good, and more importantly, she was the kind of attorney who didn't get rattled. It was too late to call tonight. I would call in the morning, early, before the office, before whatever performance of normalcy tomorrow required. I put the car in reverse. The rain hadn't let up. I drove home through it, the wipers keeping their mechanical time, thinking about everything I would need to prove and everything I already could. By the time I turned onto my street, I had the beginning of a structure in my head. Not a plan yet, but the architecture of one. That was enough to start with. I slept 4 hours. Maybe less. I know, because I watched the clock cross 2 a.m. and then 3, and the next thing I remember is my alarm at 6, and the particular quality of grayness outside my bedroom window that meant the rain had stayed overnight. I was in the office by 7:15, earlier than usual, but not so much earlier that it would register as unusual to anyone who tracked these things. Declan tracked these things. The innovation floor was quiet at that hour. Just the hum of servers and the smell of the cleaning crew's work still in the air. That particular citrus and industrial solvent combination that meant the place had been reset, made impersonal again. I liked the office at this hour. It felt like the space belonged to the work, rather than the performance of working. I made coffee from the pour-over station near the east windows, and stood there for a moment, looking out at the street 6 floors below. The rain had stopped, but the pavement was still dark with it, and the early delivery trucks were making their way through the financial district in that purposeful, unhurried way of people who are never surprised by what the morning asks of them. I found that calming. I needed something calming. My documentation folder had 37 files in it by the time I'd finished the night before. I'd been thorough and fast. Those two things don't always coexist, but 11 years of debugging code under deadline had trained me to work systematically even when my chest was tight. The transfer log, the access records, the partnership agreement with the critical clause on page 7, both patent filings with their inventor attribution sections, the complete Git commit history, exported as a CSV with timestamps intact. Everything was timestamped, everything was labeled, everything was backed up to 2 separate locations that Declan did not have access to. It wasn't enough. It was a start. I was on my second coffee when the elevator dinged. I heard Declan before I saw him. That particular laugh, easy and calibrated, the one he used when he was working. I moved toward my desk by instinct, the way you adjust your posture when you hear someone come into a room. By the time the glass door to our suite opened, I was seated, screen up, looking like I'd been there for hours. Declan came in with Marcus Velde. Marcus was our lead investor, a trim, precise man in his early 60s who had made his money in logistics software 20 years ago and now spent it backing the kind of startups that reminded him of his younger self. He'd written Nexaflow's first significant check, a seed investment that had bought us 18 months of runway, and he had the particular authority of someone who understood exactly how much his faith was worth. He came to our quarterly reviews and asked careful, intelligent questions, and never seemed impressed by anything, which meant the 2 times he'd told me a technical decision I'd made was the right call had each felt like receiving a small decoration. He and Declan were carrying paper cups from the coffee shop downstairs. They were mid-conversation. Something about a mutual contact at a Series B logistics company, and the body language between them was the body language of 2 people in the middle of an ongoing relationship. Familiar, easy, the conversational shorthand of people who'd had several meals together. I didn't know they'd been having meals together. Saul, Declan's smile when he saw me was warm, unhurried. The smile of someone who had no reason to be uncomfortable. "You're in early. Marcus and I were just grabbing breakfast. Should have texted you, but we figured you'd be deep in the weeds." He gestured affectionately toward my monitor, implying that my being deep in the weeds was a benign and predictable feature of my existence. "Morning, Marcus," I said. "Solène." Marcus gave me the small nod he gave everyone. "Declan's been telling me about the Q4 roadmap. Impressive timeline." "We're ahead of schedule on the optimization modules," I said. Which was true. I had made us ahead of schedule alone, at 11 p.m. on multiple consecutive Wednesdays. "I'd love to walk you through the technical progress at some point." "Absolutely, we'll set that up." He was already turning back to Declan, some thread of the previous conversation reasserting itself. They moved toward the small conference room at the back, coffee cups in hand, and the glass door swung shut behind them. I turned back to my screen. I am the most essential person in this company. I knew this with the same dispassion with which I knew that the prediction engine ran on 340,000 lines of code that I had written. It was a technical fact, not a boast. Without the algorithm, Nexaflow was a business plan and a Declan Marsh smile. Without Declan, Nexaflow was a sophisticated piece of software looking for a door to walk through. The difference was that Declan had spent 18 months making sure every external stakeholder saw him as the face of the company, while I had spent 18 months making sure the product actually worked. I had assumed, and this was the gap in my thinking I was most frustrated with myself about, that the work would speak for itself, that when it mattered, everyone would understand who had built what. Watching Declan and Marcus disappear into the conference room for a breakfast meeting I hadn't been invited to, I understood with cold clarity that I had been wrong about that. Relationships don't defer to the obvious. They defer to the person who showed up. Declan had been showing up. I watched the conference room for a moment, their shapes visible through the frosted glass, gesturing, laughing at something. And then I picked up my phone and walked to the soundproofed phone booth pods on the far side of the floor. I had a call to make before the workday officially began. Priya Subramaniam's office was on the 14th floor of a building on K Street, which told you most of what you needed to know about her practice. She'd graduated Georgetown a year ahead of me, gone straight into a big firm, made partner at 37, and started her own IP boutique 6 months later because, as she told me at our last dinner, she was tired of splitting the interesting work between 6 layers of supervision. She was meticulous and fast, and had a particular gift for explaining complex legal mechanics in language that didn't make you feel managed. She'd said, when I called at 7:45 that morning, "Come at 2. Bring everything." I brought everything. Her office had the organized austerity of someone who thought better without clutter. Clean lines, good light, a small jade plant on the windowsill that looked like it had been there for years. She read the partnership agreement slowly, the way a surgeon reviews imaging before an operation, and I drank green tea and watched her and said nothing. I'd learned long ago that the most useful thing you can do while a specialist works is stay out of their way. The red pen came out on page 7. She underlined the jointly developed work product clause and sat back in her chair. "Okay," she said. "I need you to understand something clearly before we talk about what to do." "Tell me." Right now, on paper, Declan could argue that Nexaflow owns everything you built, including the code you wrote before the LLC existed. She held up a hand before I could respond. He didn't steal anything yet. But he has positioned himself, possibly deliberately, possibly not, but the intent matters less than the structure, to make that argument if he wants to. And if that term sheet you mentioned is real, he wants to. I put down my tea. Walk me through the legal mechanics. She did, and I listened with the particular attention I give to things I need to understand completely. When you form a joint venture, or an LLC with a co-founder, the company becomes a separate legal entity. Anything created within the scope of that company's business can, under certain circumstances, be treated as belonging to the company rather than to you individually. That's the logic behind work-for-hire doctrine and IP assignment clauses. It exists because companies need clear ownership of their assets to attract investment, sign contracts, and operate without constant disputes about who owns what. The problem arises when founders never formally separate what existed before the company formed from what came after. The law doesn't automatically separate your pre-existing work from work you do as a member of the LLC, Priya said. If you contributed pre-existing IP to the company, which is what it looks like you did when you built the core algorithm into Nexaflow's product, the company can claim it absorbed that contribution, especially if you never executed a formal document clarifying otherwise. What would that document have looked like? She picked up her pen. Every technology partnership should execute 4 things before a single line of code is written in the company's name. First, an IP assignment agreement, not a paragraph in a partnership agreement, a standalone document that identifies all pre-existing IP by name, describes it specifically enough to be unambiguous, credits the original inventor, and sets out exactly what's being assigned to the LLC and under what terms. She wrote as she talked, a short numbered list forming on her legal pad. Second, an inventor contribution schedule attached to the operating agreement, a table that says, this specific technical work was created by this specific person on these dates, before the LLC was formed. Third, a clear definition of work-for-hire scope, what work is being done going forward as a company employee or member, versus what was done independently beforehand. And fourth, a trade secret protection protocol, ND. As for anyone with access to the technology, access controls, transfer logging, the entire architecture. I had the transfer logging, I said, which is why you caught this. But logging a breach and owning the asset being breached are 2 different positions to argue from. I looked at her list. 4 documents. A competent attorney, half a day, maybe $1,000 for proper execution. Against the cost of what I was now sitting in. A K-Street consultation that was going to run into 5 figures before it resolved. We didn't do any of that, I said. No. You have 1 clause in a partnership agreement that says the LLC owns jointly developed work product. No definition of jointly developed, no carve-out for pre-existing IP, and no inventor attribution anywhere. She set down her pen. I want to be honest with you about what that means, Solène. It means Declan has a surface-level argument, not a strong one. You have the commit history, the patent filings, and the timestamps, and those things matter enormously. But surface-level arguments in IP disputes are expensive to rebut, even when you win. So we build the case, I said. She almost smiled. We build the case. We worked through the afternoon. The plan had 3 parts. And I want to be precise about this because precision was what was going to save me. First, the evidentiary audit. I would pull every commit log from the private repository I'd maintained before we migrated to Nexaflow's infrastructure. Every design document with its metadata intact. Every message where I described technical decisions I'd made. The goal was to construct an unbroken, time-stamped record of authorship. Not just my ownership of the idea, but my ownership of the specific implementation. In IP disputes, ideas don't have owners. Specific documented expressions of ideas do. My Git commits were my fingerprints on the code, dated months before Declan and I signed anything. Think of it like prior art research, Priya said, except the prior art is your own work. That framing helped. It was a known process. I knew how to do it. Second, Priya would research third-party contact. If Declan had already represented Nexaflow's algorithm to a third party for licensing purposes, that crossed into territory well beyond a partnership dispute. The Defend Trade Secrets Act allows for federal civil claims when someone misappropriates a trade secret. And under that law, misappropriation can include disclosure to a third party without authorization. If Harlow Capital had received our algorithm documentation from Declan without my knowledge or consent, we might have a federal claim rather than just a breach of contract claim. Federal claims move differently. They also get people's attention differently. Third, we would not move yet. Declan could not know we were building. If he felt pressure, he might accelerate, execute the term sheet before we could file for injunctive relief, destroy evidence, or find some other way to move faster than we could respond. My job was to be exactly the version of myself Declan had, always counted on, head down, technically absorbed, leaving the business development to him. It was, I noted with some dark appreciation, a role I'd apparently been performing convincingly for 18 months. One more thing, Priya said, closing her legal pad. I'm going to file the groundwork for an emergency injunction motion. If he executes a licensing agreement before Thursday, I want to be able to file within hours. Thursday? I said. She looked at me. You'll need to call Marcus Velde and schedule a board-level IP audit presentation. Frame it as investor due diligence, which it is. Tell him it's routine. Don't tell him why it's actually necessary. I thought about Marcus and Declan in the conference room that morning, the easy familiarity of two people who'd been having a parallel conversation I wasn't part of. I thought about the way Marcus had said impressive timeline, and what Declan had told him to produce that response. Marcus will agree, I said. He backed 3 startups that failed on IP disputes. He takes this seriously. Then you have your formal venue, Priya said. Whatever Declan tries to build before Thursday, he'll have to answer for in that room. I called Tomas Reyes from the parking structure, the same one where I'd sat in the rain 2 nights ago. Old habits. Tomas had been a senior infrastructure engineer at my old Fortune 500, one of those methodical, unflappable people who treated every technical problem like a logic puzzle to be enjoyed, rather than a crisis to survive. He'd gone independent 3 years ago, doing forensic IT analysis and expert witness consulting, and he was very good at it because he was constitutionally incapable of exaggerating anything. That made his analysis bulletproof in legal contexts. I need a professional forensic analysis of a file transfer event, I told him. External device, specific timestamp, corporate network. I need it documented in a way that creates a defensible chain of custody. A brief pause. This for legal proceedings? Potentially. Send me the access logs and the network topology documentation. I can have preliminary findings in 48 hours. Another pause. Is this the company you've been building? The supply chain platform? Yes. He didn't ask anything more. He was that kind of person. I'll make time, he said. Send me what you have tonight. Marcus's call went more simply. I phrased it exactly as Priya had suggested. Routine IP audit, investor due diligence, standard practice before any Series A conversation. He asked 3 clarifying questions, each of which told me he'd encountered this situation before. And then he said, Thursday works. I'll bring my co-investor, Renata. She'll want to be in that conversation. I hadn't known about Renata. Declan hadn't mentioned a co-investor in any recent conversation. I wrote the name down and moved on. Marcus said as we were wrapping up, I appreciate you being proactive about this, Solène. IP clarity is where a lot of otherwise good companies come apart. I know, I said. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. The pitch deck appeared on Tuesday. Declan had put it together over the weekend. He mentioned this casually, the way he always mentioned work he'd done outside office hours, as though his own diligence was a weather condition rather than a choice. He sent it to me with a message that said, Cleaned up our positioning a little. Let me know what you think. with an exclamation point that told me he was not actually interested in what I thought. I opened it. The cover slide said, Nexaflow Pro, Next Generation AI Supply Chain Intelligence, Clean Design, Professional Palette, the sort of deck that said someone had paid attention to venture aesthetics. I scrolled through it with the same methodical care I'd been applying to everything this week, reading each slide, twice before moving to the next. Slide 8 stopped me. It was a team slide. Declan's photograph, his credentials, his accomplishments in the enterprise sales space. Under his name in the role field, lead architect and co-founder. My name was not on the slide. I sat with that for a moment. I've trained myself over the years not to let anger be the first thing. Anger is loud, and it takes up space that strategy needs. What I felt instead was something colder and more clarifying. The recognition of an action whose meaning was unambiguous. Declan Marsh had presented himself to prospective investors as the lead architect of a platform he had not written a single line of. He had done this in a slide deck designed for external distribution. That was not an oversight. Oversights don't produce polished graphics. I replied to his message, good design. A few things to discuss when you have a minute. Neutral, professional, the tone of a colleague with minor feedback. He would read it as minimal engagement. He was used to reading me that way. I forwarded the deck to Priya. She called me within 20 minutes. The lead architect line, she said. Yes. That's not just a contract dispute anymore, Solène. If that deck goes to investors with him listed as lead architect, and if investors put money in based on that representation, we're potentially talking about material misrepresentation to investors, which creates exposure well beyond IP law. What kind of exposure? The kind that involves securities regulators rather than just civil courts. A pause. I want to be careful here. I need to research the specific facts before I make any strong claims. But I want you to understand the full shape of what might be happening. I already understood the full shape. That's what the whole week had been. Watching a shape I'd sensed in an amber flag on a Monday night come into full relief, line by line, decision by decision. That afternoon, Priya emailed me something else. Declan had formed a separate LLC 2 weeks ago. Marsh Tech Ventures. I stared at the filing document she'd attached. It was public record, found through a routine corporate search. And I thought about timing. 2 weeks ago, Declan had still been sitting across from me in our weekly syncs, talking about our Q4 roadmap, using the word we with complete fluency. 2 weeks ago, he had been building the structure he planned to receive whatever he took. The next morning, Tomas sent his preliminary report. He'd been efficient. I'd given him everything he needed. And he was the kind of engineer who works fast when the problem is well defined. The external device Declan had used to copy NF_core, _algo, _V7, _final had a device registration profile in the transfer log metadata. Tomas had cross-referenced it with the device's manufacturer identifier. The registration matched a device registered to Marsh Tech Ventures, not Nexaflow, not Declan Marsh personally, Marsh Tech Ventures. This was not a backup. This was a transfer of assets to a separate corporate entity. That distinction mattered the way the difference between negligence and intent matters. It changed the entire character of the event. I forwarded Tomas's report to Priya. She replied with 4 words, filing the injunction groundwork now. Declan's text arrived Wednesday evening while I was in the middle of cross-referencing my commit history against the design documents I'd exported. Great meeting with Harlow Capital today. Think we're close. You should really let me handle the business side, Sol. It's where I shine. I read it standing at my kitchen counter with a glass of water in my hand. The breezy confidence of it, the assumption that I would receive this as good news, that you should really let me handle the business side was a sentence I would simply accept rather than examine. The soul, which he used when he wanted to sound collegial. Priya's email came at 9 that evening. She'd obtained access to a preliminary term sheet. I didn't ask how, and she didn't explain, but Priya had been practicing IP law on K Street for 15 years, and I trusted her means. Harlow Capital. a preliminary term sheet representing Nexaflow's algorithm as co-developed IP owned by the LLC. A proposed licensing structure worth $500,000 in the first year. $500,000. The same figure as our entire seed round. The number Declan had watched me build from a private repository and a set of patent filings across 11 months of work that predated everything we'd built together. I sat down at my kitchen table and looked at Priya's email for a long time. Then I opened my documentation folder, which now had 73 files in it, and I began building the presentation I would deliver in 48 hours. Not Declan's presentation. Mine. The one that would walk Marcus Velde and his co-investor Renata through the complete technical history of Nexaflow's core IP, time-stamped and attributed and documented in the kind of detail that left no room for alternative interpretation. I worked until midnight. I went to bed feeling, for the first time all week, something that wasn't dread. He came by my desk on Thursday morning with 2 coffees. This was not unusual. Declan was good at small gestures, had always been good at them, and coffee was the kind of gesture that said partnership without requiring anything specific. He set 1 cup near my keyboard and leaned against the desk partition with his own, easy and familiar. "You've been quiet this week," he said. "Everything okay, partner?" The word partner landed in a specific way. I noted it. I looked up from my screen and gave him the same unhurried smile he'd given me 100 times. The one that said nothing is wrong. Everything is fine. We are exactly what we've always been. Never better, I said. I'm really looking forward to today. He tilted his head slightly, a flicker of something crossing his face before the easy smile returned. Big plans. Just a board meeting, I said. You know how it is. Always good to keep everyone aligned. He nodded, satisfied, and moved toward his own desk. His coffee cup was still in his hand, and his stride had the particular quality of a man who believes he's in control of the morning. He had no idea what Thursday actually was. I turned back to my screen, opened my presentation, and went to work. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides, which meant everyone on the innovation floor could see in. I had always liked that about it. The transparency felt appropriate for a company built on the premise that better information produced better outcomes. This morning I liked it for a different reason. Whatever happened in the next 2 hours would happen in full view. I arrived 20 minutes early and arranged the room myself. This was unusual. We had an office coordinator who handled meeting setup. But I wanted the chairs where I wanted them, and the screen calibrated to my laptop, not Declan's. Small things. The kind of things that don't look like control but are. I placed a glass of water at every seat, set a legal pad and pen at my own place, and connected to the room's display system to run a quick check on my presentation. Everything loaded cleanly. I closed the application and sat down. Priya arrived at 8:50. She was in a charcoal suit I hadn't seen before, carrying a slim leather portfolio that contained printed copies of 4 documents: Tomas's forensic attribution report, the file transfer log with the device match, the Harlow Capital term sheet, and the Marsh Tech Ventures LLC filing. She glanced around the room and gave me a single nod. The nod of someone who had walked into enough conference rooms to know when a room has been prepared correctly. She took the seat at the far end of the table. Outside counsel for IP compliance review, as Marcus had noted on the amended invite without further explanation. Declan had replied to that invite with a thumbs-up emoji. Marcus came in at 8:58 with Renata Osei, his co-investor, who I was meeting for the first time. She was a small, precise woman in her late 50s, who shook my hand with the grip of someone accustomed to making an impression in the first 3 seconds. She said, "I've been looking forward to understanding the technical foundation here." And I understood from her tone that Marcus had told her enough to come prepared. Declan arrived at 9:02. He had coffee from downstairs and the particular ease of a man who considers 2 minutes late a statement of confidence rather than discourtesy. He saw Priya at the far end of the table and registered a half-second of something before his expression resettled. "Priya Subramaniam," I said. "Outside counsel for IP compliance review." Right, Marcus mentioned. He shook her hand, smooth and practiced, the same handshake he gave everyone. Good to have you. He sat down, opened his laptop, and pulled up the Nexaflow Pro deck without apparent self-consciousness. The cover slide filled the room's display. Next-generation AI supply chain intelligence, clean and professional, the product of a weekend spent on aesthetics rather than attribution. Marcus opened the meeting with the manner of someone who had run a great many meetings and found most of them inefficient. He moved through the preamble briskly. This was a routine IP audit as part of Nexaflow's investor due diligence process. The goal was complete attribution clarity on the company's core technology before any Series A conversation, and both founders were being asked to present a full IP history. Standard practice, he said, looking at no one in particular. Any sophisticated investor would expect it. Declan went first. He was good. I had always known he was good. And watching him now, I felt the same dispassionate recognition I'd felt 18 months ago in that WeWork conference room. Watching him absorb my pitch and reflect it back in slightly more polished language. He presented with the fluency of someone who had told this story many times. Nexaflow's origin as a solution to a real logistics problem, the two founders' complementary skill sets, the platform's technical sophistication. He used the word we consistently, inclusively, the pronoun of partnership. He described the algorithm as their jointly developed platform and his own contribution as architectural vision and product direction. He gestured at the slides with comfortable authority. He looked like the lead architect. I watched him, and I watched the board members tracking where their attention went and what their faces did. Marcus was impassive. Renata was taking notes. Declan's posture and delivery said, "This is my company. I built this. I am the story you're investing in." It was a compelling performance. Then Priya said, "Mr. Marsh, can you point to any code commits, design documents, or invention disclosures that bear your name or credentials in Nexaflow's development repository?" The question landed in the room like a key turning in a lock. Declan's smile didn't falter immediately. His instincts told him to treat the question as reasonable and answer it confidently. "I've been focused on the strategic and architectural side," he said. "High-level direction, product vision, that kind of input. The detailed implementation was Solène's area. That's how we structured the collaboration." "So there are no commits, design documents, or invention disclosures in the development repository bearing your name?" I just said, "My contributions were at a higher level." "Yes," Priya said. "I heard you." She opened her portfolio. She placed a printed document in front of Marcus first, then Renata, then the third board member, who'd joined by video. She was precise about the order and unhurried about the pace, and the room watched her move the way you watch someone who knows exactly what they're doing. Tomas's forensic attribution report was 847 pages. The printed version in front of the board members was a 60-page executive summary with appendices tabbed and labeled, but the full report lived on the USB drive Priya set beside each copy. Every Git commit in Nexaflow's core development repository. Every design document with its metadata intact. Every architecture decision log. Every code review. 14 months of technical work, not 12, not 11, but 14. Because Tomas had found the earliest ancestral modules in my private repository and traced the lineage forward with the patience of someone who understood that chain of custody is built one link at a time. Every document bore my name, my credentials, my email address, my timestamps. Not one bore Declan's. Marcus picked up his copy and began reading. He didn't look up. Priya placed a second document, the file transfer log from 3 weeks ago, the amber flag that had started everything, with Tomas's forensic analysis appended, the device metadata, the registration match, the corporate name attached to the device registration. Marsh Tech Ventures, LLC, not Nexaflow, not a personal backup drive. A separately incorporated entity, formed 2 weeks before the transfer, designed to receive exactly what it had received. Renata looked up from the second document and looked at Declan. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Priya placed a third document. The preliminary term sheet Declan had signed with Harlow Capital. $500,000 first-year licensing. Nexaflow's algorithm described in the term. Sheets recitals as co-developed IP owned by the LLC. Declan Marsh, listed as authorized signatory and lead technical architect. The room was very quiet. Declan's composure had been eroding in small increments since the second document, the way a structure doesn't collapse all at once but shows its stress in sequence. First a hairline, then a crack, then the thing underneath the crack. Now he looked at the term sheet in front of Marcus, and I watched the calculation happen behind his eyes, the rapid inventory of options, and I watched him arrive at the one he thought he still had. He turned to me. "This is absurd," he said. The warmth was gone from his voice. What was left underneath it was something harder and more honest. "You want to litigate over who wrote what? You're a coder, Sol. That's what you do. I built this company." He gestured at the room, the glass walls, the innovation floor beyond, as if the physical space proved his point. "You'd still be writing scripts for someone else's startup if I hadn't given you the platform to matter." The room went very still. I had imagined this moment on the drive home in the rain 3 weeks ago, and in the parking structure, and in every quiet hour since. I had imagined what I would feel: anger, or vindication, or the specific satisfaction of having been right. What I actually felt, sitting there with my hands flat on the table and Declan's contempt directed at me like a flashlight, was remarkably calm. The calm of someone who has done the work. The calm of documentation. I set down my pen. Slowly, with the same deliberate care with which I'd set down my coffee cup 3 weeks ago, when the amber flag first appeared. I looked at him steadily. "Actually, Declan," I said, "I gave you the platform. You just forgot to read the terms." Marcus Velda closed the term sheet in front of him. The sound was very precise in the quiet room, small and final. He looked at Declan. Not at me, at Declan. "I think," he said, "we need to pause this meeting and get our full legal team on the phone." Priya filed for emergency injunctive relief that afternoon. The filing moved fast because the groundwork had been laid for 3 weeks, and because Tomas's forensic report gave the court exactly what courts want in IP disputes: a clear, time-stamped, professionally documented paper trail, establishing who made what and when. Courts don't resolve IP ownership on the basis of who gives the better presentation or whose name appears on the company website. They look for the documentary record, commit histories, design files, metadata, inventor disclosures, the unglamorous bureaucratic infrastructure of creation, and whoever built that paper trail is, in the eyes of the law, the person who built the thing. I had built it because building systems that left evidence of their own construction was simply how I had always worked. The injunction halted the Harlow Capital term sheet and froze all Nexaflow IP transfers pending litigation. Harlow's own legal team, reviewing the injunction filing, found the discrepancy immediately. The man listed as lead architect had no visible authorship record for the technology he'd represented as his contribution. They withdrew the term sheet the same day and referred the matter to the SEC as a potential material misstatement in a securities context. Priya called me at 7 that evening with the particular controlled satisfaction of someone delivering news they have been professionally patient about. "Harlow's referral is their own liability management," she said, "but it means there's now a parallel inquiry into Marsh Tech Ventures that we don't have to drive." The board met again 4 days later. Declan's attorney was present, which told me everything about what kind of meeting he understood it to be. The vote to remove him as co-founder and managing member was 3-0, with Marcus abstaining on advice of counsel. The grounds were breach of fiduciary duty and misappropriation of trade secrets under the Defend Trade Secrets Act, which prohibits acquiring a trade secret by improper means and disclosing it to third parties without authorization. The device registered to Marsh Tech Ventures, combined with the Harlow term sheet, established both elements with the kind of clarity that makes legal proceedings shorter than they might otherwise be. Declan said nothing during the vote. He had finally understood that the room had read Tomas's report. A week after the board meeting, I sat in Priya's office on K Street with the afternoon light coming through her windows. She slid a document across the desk to me. An IP assignment agreement. A real one, this time. She walked me through it clause by clause, with the thoroughness of someone who wanted me to understand every sentence rather than simply sign it. The agreement named me as inventor. It identified the specific work product being assigned, Nexaflow's core prediction engine, the data weighting methodology, the optimization architecture, by name and by reference to the technical documentation already in evidence. It contained an explicit inventor contribution schedule, attached as Exhibit A, crediting every major technical component to me with dates of original development. It defined work for hire scope for any future development under the restructured company. It contained a trade secret access protocol, tiered access controls, mandatory logging, NDA requirements for any party granted repository access. Everything that should have existed 18 months ago in the WeWork conference room on Capitol Hill, when Declan had smiled warmly and said that stuff, works itself out. It hadn't worked itself out. I had worked it out. With Priya and Tomas, and 73 files in a documentation folder, and 3 weeks of controlled, methodical effort. That distinction mattered to me, not for vanity's sake, but because the lesson of the past 3 weeks wasn't that bad partners get caught. It was that paper catches them. Documentation is not bureaucracy. It is architecture. It holds weight. I read every clause. I asked 4 questions. Then I signed. The civil suit resolved 9 months later. $340,000 in damages for misappropriation and misrepresentation, plus attorney's fees. The SEC inquiry into Marsh Tech Ventures ran parallel and longer. That process was not mine to manage, and I left it to the people whose job it was. I was busy. Marcus called me 2 weeks after I signed the IP assignment agreement. He said, without preamble, "I'd like to lead your Series A." He acknowledged he should have requested an IP audit at the seed stage, that he knew better, that he'd watched IP disputes kill 3 companies he'd backed and had still trusted a handshake, and that he was prepared to back the restructured Nexaflow at a valuation that reflected what the technology was actually worth. $4.2 million. Closed 6 months after the injunction was granted. I hired a head of sales, someone whose job it specifically was to be in the rooms I wasn't in, someone with a contract that specified exactly what that role encompassed and what it did not. The hiring agreement included an IP acknowledgement clause. Priya drafted it. It was half a page long. I stayed late on a Thursday, 6 months into what I had started thinking of simply as Nexaflow. Not the one with the amber flags and the handshake and handwave approach to ownership, but mine, with its correct documentation and its clean lines and its future, that was legible to me the way a well-architected system is legible, every component identified, every dependency mapped, every input and output accounted for. The office was empty. It was almost 11, the same hour I'd been standing at this desk the night I first saw the amber flag. The HVAC hummed through the ceiling ducts. Somewhere outside, the city was doing what cities do. The low, persistent noise of 800,000 people living their lives. And in here, there was just the blue light of my screen and the small sounds of a building at rest. A notification appeared. Not amber. A clean, institutional blue. The color of the USPTO's interface, which I'd been staring at for 15 years across 2 patents, and now 3. Inventor attribution formally recorded. My name was on it. Solène Adeyemi-Park. Inventor. It was exactly what had always been true. Demonstrably, documentably, time-stampedly true. True in the Git commits and in the design files and in the forensic report that ran to 847 pages. It had been true in the WeWork conference room when Declan was talking about revenue splits and I was thinking I should circle back to the IP question and then didn't. The The difference was that now the record said so. Officially, permanently, in the ledger of things that are registered and attributed, and cannot be argued away. I read the notification once. I closed my laptop. I turned off the light.